Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox back again for another episode, and you're in for a treat today. Why? Number one, I have a fellow Southerner, so that's always a good news. But number two, we have Charlie Spillers, and he has one of the most unique stories I've come across. Charlie, with that incredibly long winded introduction, first of all, welcome and thank you so much for taking the time to visit with me today.
Thanks so much, Tom, and thanks for having me on your program. And for your viewers, I'll tell them lower expectations. I'll try to mumble through this.
Why don't you start off by giving us just a history of your professional background?
I guess the 10-second history would be one, I'm an author. Prior to that, I was a career federal prosecutor. I served as the justice attache for Iraq and spent a total of about 22 months in Iraq for the Department of Justice, advising the court that tried Saddam Hussein, and then later on as the justice attache, representing the department and the attorney general with the military, the State Department, and all of the other countries. My work in Iraq was commended by the FBI director, the British ambassador, and Britain's Minister of State for the Armed Forces. Prior to that, as I said, I was a federal prosecutor for over 20 years. Prior to that, I was in law enforcement for about 18 years, and 10 years of that was working undercover, including deep cover operations. In fact, on my book, Confessions of an Undercover Agent, the reason I wrote that book is because when I became a federal prosecutor, working with different agencies, DEA, FBI, Secret Service, all the different agencies, including some that involved undercover operations, I came to realize that the experiences I had were fairly unique, that I had not run across others who had worked undercover as long as I did, 10 years, and I had not run across others who had worked on such a variety of criminals, everything from burglars and safecrackers, drug trafficking organizations, Dixie Mafia, auto theft rings, Mexican and Mafia linked drug smuggling operations, the gamut of it. So that's when I realized that since my experiences were fairly unique, maybe people would be interested in hearing about those experiences, not because they were about me, but simply because they were interesting. So that's why I wrote the book. By the way, on the fact that I've received commendations through my career, including from the British ambassador in Iraq and the Britain's Minister of State for the Armed Forces. I used to think things like that meant something. But many months ago, I came home from the grocery store and I put the grocery bags on the island in the kitchen, and my wife started going through it while I turned around and do other things. And behind me, I heard her say, "The milk." I said, "Huh? The milk." I said, "Being one of the bag, I don't see the milk." I said, "But isn't it one of the bag?" "No, I don't see the milk." I said, "But you forgot the milk." "But is it?" "No, you forgot the milk. You forgot the milk." I said, "But I've been commended by the British ambassador." She said, "I don't care. You forgot the milk." So those commendations don't really go very far. You still have to remember what to pick up at the grocery store. You still have to put out the trash can on trash day. And you still have to pay full price or senior price for a cup of coffee. So those don't go all that far.
When we finish up, I'll tell you the lesson my father learned on always bringing the groceries home, but that would be another subject. Let me start by asking, because of your unique frontline experience as a law enforcement officer and an undercover officer, how did that help you as a prosecutor when you moved to the DOJ?
Tom, that's an excellent question. That is a great question. It helped tremendously because as I prepared for cases, I knew about things that might happen between the agents and the criminals that maybe they wouldn't think was important and wouldn't ordinarily report. So I would ask who transported the defendant from where you arrested him to the police station or to the sheriff's office. Who transported him? And then I'd talk to that agent or that deputy or that police officer and say, "Look, during the ride, did he say anything at all? Did y'all talk? Did you even talk about the weather? Who fingerprinted him? Who did the rap sheet? Who did his personal history? While you were doing that, did he say anything?" And what I'd find is, boy, there'd be these great gems of incriminating statements that were usable because he had been advised of his Miranda rights, stuff that ordinarily prosecutors wouldn't think to ask, and that officers or agents wouldn't think to volunteer for not thinking. So that was just a little thing. And of course, there were dozens of other things, but yes, it was very helpful. That's an excellent question, Tom.
I came out of the FCPA world in anti-corruption compliance, and there was one major trial where there was a cooperating witness, and the jury actually felt the witness fell out of favor because they felt like the FBI agents were too close to the cooperating witness. Did that come up with undercover agents, or is that a completely different category of witness?
I never trying to think about it. I don't think that's ever come up where I've had that situation. Now, there's other situations though where agents, and I've worked, in fact, with all my experience, I've taught undercover operations. I've taught informant, recruitment, development, and control and management. I've taught all those stuff, besides teaching search and seizure and things like that. But the thing that I would encounter would be where an agent would get close to the informant, but not close where they did anything wrong, but close to where the agent wasn't critical about the information or about what the informant would wind up using the agent. And sometimes playing one agent off against another, that if one agent paid him more money or treated him more nicely, he'd work with that agent more. And sometimes these informants would manipulate the agents. Every now and then I'd encounter that, not too often, thank goodness. And by the way, of course, I've used informants undercover besides working cold. And although you can't trust informants, you can't trust them, at the same time, informants saved my life on some occasions. And I think I might have covered some of those times in books. They've actually saved my life and put themselves on the line. Another thing about informants is oftentimes the agent or the undercover agent is protected by the shield and the badge and the organization behind him. But these informants, whenever it becomes known they've been cooperating, unless they go in the witness protection program, they're pretty exposed. And I have put some in the witness protection program. I have just relocated some, but others are out there and they take a lot of risks. So at the same time, although in general you can't trust informants, at the same time, they put themselves on the line even more than we do. And I've used informants sometimes over a period of years. They'll call me up and report information. But good question about that, Tom. Very good question.
Let me turn to your life and role as an undercover agent or undercover police officer and ask maybe what toll did that take on you? You mentioned 10 years in deep cover. That's got to be one of the longest tenures. And what did that do to you upstairs?
As I tell people, it didn't affect me at all. In the epilogue of Confessions of an Undercover Agent, I wrote 4 or 5 pages at the end about the aftermath of working undercover. And of course, it did affect me. It turned out all that stress through all those years had weakened my immune system. And because of that, every bug that came along, I caught it. And every bug that came along, it affected me even more severely because of my immune system. And I had ulcers, things like that. But it also affected me in different ways. It took about maybe 2 years after I did my last undercover case, which was that 3,000-pound deal, about 2 years after that, before I felt comfortable using my real name when I met people. Look, if I went to get the oil changed in my car, this is after working undercover and topside and all that. If I went to get the oil changed in my car, normally somebody might talk to you and you're talking with them, somebody sitting in the waiting room. Hey, I'm James Smith. Yeah. And, I didn't introduce myself by another name just because I felt naked using my real name. I felt like being in combat and there's rounds coming in and I don't have a helmet or any body armor on. So finally, after a couple of years, I got to where I could use my real name comfortably and not stress out about it. But that's a good question. And at the same time, the other thing is 10 years of undercover disrupted our normal family life. We did not, and I wrote about that in the book, we did not have a normal family life. And my wife occasionally wound up being exposed to danger herself. I had a long interview with a news media, and they covered everything. And at the end of it, it was a statewide newspaper. They said, "Would you do it all over again?" And I wrote, this was a written interview for the paper, and I wrote, "Yeah, it was stressful and it was dangerous, but I'd probably do it all over again because I made cases on people that I don't think ever would have gotten caught. So yeah, I'd probably do it all over again, but not as long." And I explained in the interview, and I tagged this on, that night before sending in the answer, I was reading that answer to my wife while we were in bed. And when I read it to her, "Would you do it all over again?" Tears started rolling down her face, and she started crying. And she said, "That was the worst, that was the most terrible 10 years of my life. That was the most terrible." That's what she said. And so what I did was I wrote about that. I quoted her on that interview, and I put, "So the answer is no, I wouldn't do it all over again." That's how it affects you. And so Undercover is great. I loved it because you get to use every capability you have. If you don't, one, you won't be successful. Two, you won't survive. So you have to really use your mind and capabilities. And I loved it for that reason. But no, I wouldn't do it all over again. If I did, I'd only do it for a year or two, and that'd be all.
One of the reasons I was really excited to talk to you was about your work on the global stage. And maybe if I could start with, how did the undercover work really help you? I can imagine a lot of things in Iraq, but some may be true, some not. But how did that prepare you to literally step on the global stage as a lawyer, not a law enforcement officer?
I think here's what Undercover did. Because of the undercover work and the risk and dangers involved, every time you go undercover, you're exposed to danger. I became expert, extremely good at reading people, and picking up how they were feeling. Or if somebody was trying to hide something, all of a sudden I could see this micro frown on a face replaced by a smile. Or I could see when somebody was tense and maybe trying to hide it. I could tell when somebody was relaxed. Working undercover helped me throughout my careers as a federal prosecutor, dealing with witnesses and in trial, dealing with informants, dealing with others, and of course, on the global scene, when I dealt with others, with other officials, I could feel and tell how they were feeling. I tell you what helped me undercover. I'm not undercover, but helped me in Iraq, being from the South. No, really, because in the Middle East, as you probably well know, and as many of your listeners, viewers will know, in the Middle East, Middle Easterners have a reputation for being hospitable, very gracious and very hospitable people, and also generous. In the South, we have some of those same characteristics, and of course, up north, folks are too. But we're pretty much known for that in the South, and more slow pace. So, whenever I dealt with Iraqi officials, I my mannerisms, my personality, and the way that we interacted was very similar to theirs. So instead of sitting down with, say, the president of the Iraqi High Tribunal, that's the court that tried Saddam, instead of sitting down with him in his office and immediately getting to the list of things we wanted to cover that morning about this and that, instead, I was more likely to ask how he was doing. We would have some chai or some tea together, and then we would gradually get down to business. What I observed was some people from perhaps other sections of the US would come into meetings and they would immediately get to what they wanted to talk about, which was fine, but at the same time, it didn't fit with the Iraqis and their lifestyle. So I think it helped me tremendously. And I don't mean to demean any others by saying that. I'm just saying slow pace. As a matter of fact, we had, of course, our translators. and I'd try to pick up phrases from them. And I'd use those phrases sometimes with the Iraqi officials just to show that I was trying to learn things like Assalamu alaikum, wa alaikum assalam, Sonic, alhamdulillah, kulizin. But I taught our translators, Assalamu alaikum, peace be with you. I taught my translators to say, Assalamu alaikum, y'all. So we had a good time. And every now and then I would hear back from them over the years, and they would remind me about Assalamu alaikum, y'all.
A couple of weeks ago, I interviewed a journalist who grew up in East Texas, and he was in both Iraq wars. And he said the same thing about being a Texan, that he got more mileage talking to people like he would when he grew up in a town called Palestine, talking to folks like he did in Palestine.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's a great point. By the way, you know in my background that I fought in Vietnam as a Marine squad leader. And in Iraq, I dealt with everyone, including the U.S. military, including the general, I can't even pronounce it, the commanding general of all American and military forces in Iraq. And I dealt with major generals and lieutenant generals, and I dealt with every branch of the military. The one thing I want to say about that is how impressed I am with our military that served in Iraq. They were true professionals. I mean, from the lowest ranks to the highest ranks. And like we did, when I was there with DOJ, our work week was 7 days a week, actually 6.5 days a week, because we got one afternoon off so we could go do our washing and clean our hooches and all that. But the military was the same way, 7 days a week. And they were working like we were, even worse, 14, 16 hours a day and sometimes longer. Very professional, very highly organized, courageous, smart people. I tell you, Americans can be proud of their military services, all of them.
Why was it so important to have a trial for Saddam Hussein?
The Saddam took care of his enemies by torture and execution. And of course, and I worked on those cases where we had witness records about being tortured and about people who witnessed these executions. We wanted the leaders of Iraq and we wanted the courts to have credibility. And you have credibility, a court has credibility and the support of the people when there's due process, which means you, quote, get your fair trial. You get to have your say. You get attorneys representing you. If the Iraqis had had their way, they would have executed Saddam within days, probably tortured him first. But instead, the U.S. helped set up the Iraqi High Tribunal, the High Court, to try war crimes, genocide, and crimes against humanity. And that court, in fact, I wrote, I think, about a 50-page witness statement, expert statement for the High Court of England and Wales about the Iraqi High Tribunal. And it was a war crimes case that involved some Iraqis and the British military. And in that case, basically the Iraqi High Tribunal, the Iraqi court was being put on trial for world opinion. The organizations that were going to court in England were trying to show that the Iraqi court could not give a fair trial, that they didn't have proper rules, that they were political. They would just do summary trials and execute people. That wasn't the case at all. And so the Iraqi court went to trial, and the High Court of England and Wales wound up holding that the court could give a fair trial. And then the plaintiffs appealed to the Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg, France, and that was dismissed. So it was important that the people in Iraq realized that their courts would be credible, or would hold their courts as being credible. So that's why it was so important. I didn't get into that such a long answer about that, but
No,
very complicated subject.
no, I think it was your answer was great, because I think it was incredibly important that Iraq show the world that.
Let me switch to something maybe that get to something a little more mundane for your audience. When I was working undercover, when I first started working undercover, I learned an important lesson about criminals. In Baton Rouge, I'd infiltrated a ring of safecrackers and burglars. Randy was a renowned safecracker in the underworld. And one afternoon, Randy and his sidekick Candyman and I were sitting in a bar in Baton Rouge. In his early afternoon, the bar was where a lot of career criminals hung out, almost like a headquarters. The three of us were sitting at the bar, and while we were sitting at the bar, Randy reached under the shirt. He pulled out a 38 just under the bar counter. He said, "I got this last night." And he passed it to Candyman sitting between us. Candyman looked at it and passed it to me. It was Blue Steel 38. I'm working in intelligence. My job wasn't to make cases. It was to gather intelligence, file these intelligence reports, and they'd send them to the detectives to follow up without revealing they came from an undercover agent. And I'm looking at the gun, and you know what I'm thinking? I'm thinking, I need to get the serial number on it and remember that and put that in my report. The problem was it was Blue Steel. The light was a little dim in the bar, and I couldn't read the serial number. So I said, "Hey, Randy, hey, I can use this." I slipped it in my pocket. Oh my gosh, when I did, it was like you poked a hornet's nest. All of a sudden, Randy, "Hey, Mike," I was using the name Mike, give my gun back. And the Candyman, "Give him the gun back." And I said, "Hey, man," took a swig of my beer. I said, "I can use it. I'll give it back tomorrow." All of a sudden, I hear, feeling my side. And I looked down, and Candyman had stuck his gun in my side. And his finger was on the trigger. And he said, give it back, Mike." Boy, just hissing. Boy, they were mad. I looked at the gun and I thought, of course, I'm thinking you're thinking fast. I'm thinking, we're in a bar, kind of criminal headquarters, but they won't shoot me in public. So I said, "Hey, man, I'll give it back tomorrow." And I go to take another drink of my beer, and I hear click, click. Yeah, click. And I looked down and he had cocked it. Yeah, and now when you cock a revolver, it can make a click, but it's not very loud at all. Tom, I'll tell you what, though, when it's in your side, you're going to hear it click. And I looked down, his finger was on the trigger, the hammer was all the way back, and his eyes were glazing over. And I said, okay, man, I give it back. So real slowly, because I was afraid if I made a sudden movement, his finger might jerk. And I was thinking, gosh, I hope he doesn't sneeze. I hope he doesn't hiccup. I hope he doesn't cough. I hope somebody doesn't walk behind him and just happen to bump him. And so I said, "Yeah, man." So slowly I reached in my pocket. I pulled out the 38, I reached past him, gave it back to Randy. Now here came the real dangerous part. Candyman uncocked the gun. But he uncocked the gun with it still jammed in my side. Now, you know this, Tom, and many of your viewers know it. How do you uncock a revolver? You uncock a revolver by putting your thumb on the hammer that's all the way back and you pull the trigger. And you try to let the hammer down slowly. And if you let the hammer down slowly, then the gun won't go off. But if your thumb slips, bam, the gun goes off. Or if you let it down too fast, bam, the gun goes off. My neighbor, who's a firearms instructor, I was telling him about that a few years ago. And he said, "Yeah," he said, "I've had them go off twice on me on the range when I've done that, and I'm a firearms instructor." So Candyman pulls the trigger, starts letting the hammer down, and it's going slowly down, and my insides are just twisting. I could just imagine the gun going off and my guts being blown all over the floor. Boy, he was letting that down. And you know what? That took maybe 3 seconds for that hammer to finally go all the way down while the gun was in my side. And of course, I took a deep breath then. And as I tell people, that was only 3 seconds. But for 3 seconds, time was frozen. For 3 seconds, the world didn't exist for me. The walking, talking, breathing, the world you're part of, I wasn't part of that. I wasn't part of that at all for those 3 seconds. As I tell folks, and I saw this example before, is how long or 3 seconds? Think about this. What are 3 seconds when you're sitting down and you see an attractive woman walking by in the park? You know, those seconds go by fast. What about those seconds when you're under a drill in the dentist's office? Anyway, so as I said, that was early in my undercover career. And I learned an important lesson then that helped me throughout my career. I learned that criminals don't practice firearm safety. No, they don't. Criminals do not. And I wrote about some other instances in the book where criminals I was dealing with failed to practice firearm safety. The good thing about it is we can laugh about it now, but oh my gosh, I think I still shake from those 3 seconds.
Mike, let me end by asking you, and we're recording this in May of 2025. What advice would you give to either an aspiring student, college student, high school student, or other that might want to consider law enforcement, either city, county, state, federal level? Or what advice would you give to someone who's just started out their career right now?
That's a good question, Tom. Of course, law enforcement is much more difficult now than it was when I was in, much more difficult. At the same time, it's a way of serving the public, of trying to help your community. And the part I loved about law enforcement was not only helping others, but the part I loved was chasing criminals, bad criminals. And every community, small and large in the U.S., has career criminals. And I know because I worked on those people. And people who 24/7 do nothing but think about how they can victimize others and sometimes hurt others. And for me, it was always fulfilling as an agent, as an investigator, and as a prosecutor, identifying the worst of those career criminals and trying to develop cases on them. Sometimes you could do it quickly, and sometimes it might take 2 years of investigative work to take down a major violent criminal organization. And that's very satisfying. The other thing about it is the people that you work with in law enforcement are some of the best people you'll ever know in your entire life. For those who want to engage in public service, those who want to use their capabilities, law enforcement offers those opportunities. I couldn't say enough about it. It's difficult, but I couldn't say enough about how satisfying and rewarding it is to serve as a law enforcement officer, local, state, or federal.
Mike, unfortunately, we are near, sorry, Charlie. He got me calling you Mike. Charlie,
that's okay, Ricky.
All right. We're at the end of our time, but before we leave, I wanted to ask you if our listeners wanted to connect with you in any way or certainly find out more about your book, what would be the best place or places for them to go?
Oh, sure. Of course, the book is on Amazon. It's not only Confessions of an Undercover Agent, but the novels I've written, the Frank Marsh novels I've written. And I've got another one that'll be coming out in about 3 weeks, another novel, and I'm working on the next one already. And I'm working on a book about Vietnam and a book about Iraq. So they'll be coming out. So anyway, go on Amazon. You can find the books in hardcover, paperback, Kindle editions, and some in Audible editions. You can also find me on LinkedIn, Charlie Spillers. You can find me on social media, especially Facebook, Charlie Spillers. Anyway, I love to hear from listeners. I love to hear from those who enjoy the book and enjoy reading.
Charlie, I really enjoyed this. I hope we can continue this conversation.
Tom, thank you so much. And I hope you have a great day. Thank you.
Compliance Podcast Network. Start your mornings with daily compliance news, quick, sharp updates on the top compliance and ethics stories in under 5 minutes every morning in Compliance Podcast Network. Because compliance never sleeps. Need practical advice fast? Check out Compliance Tip of the Day. One actionable idea to level up your program. Short and sweet, every day on Compliance Podcast Network. Got 10 minutes? We've got the week's top 10 stories. 10 for 10 brings you the big compliance headlines. Fast, fun, and focused. Every Saturday on Compliance Podcast Network. And don't miss the Sunday Book Review, where compliance meets culture through must-read books and big ideas every Sunday in Compliance Podcast Network. Whether you're in the office, on a walk, or commuting, stay smart, stay ethical, stay tuned. Only on the Compliance Podcast Network, available wherever you listen to podcasts.